Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Mr. Fingers, Cerebral Hemispheres. Mr. Fingers is the alias for Larry Heard, a Chicago house producer credited with being one of the pioneers of the deep house and acid house movements, I believe. Mainly the former. And this was not a name I ever expected to see again in 2018. I think I heard his breakout single, Can You Feel It, once or twice a really long time ago, purely because I knew of its historical value and importance to electronic music in general. And maybe I also got a random Pandora recommendation for it in high school or something at one point. But I wasn't so into it that I wanted to jump into everything the guy had to offer. But once I heard there was going to be an actual new album from this guy, breaking a hiatus of 24 years, or 13 if you include stuff under his real name, I felt like I needed to cover it. First of all, in order to brush up on yet another electronic music legend I've been sleeping on, and especially since I'm not super up to date on my Chicago house as I probably should be. I mean, ironically, considering I've lived in Chicago my whole life. I mean, most of my favorite bands are European, but whatever. So I decided to go ahead and listen to all his stuff, including his mainline albums under his real name Larry Heard, since he only had 3 previous albums as Mr. Fingers. So, how about I go down his discography so far? Okay, I think this is the kind of album that I feel like I need to have been there when it came out to get the full effect out of it. I mean, don't get me wrong, I liked it a lot, and I know how ahead of its time is. I mean, it came out back in 1988 before any of the other artists I like were able to build on it. But yeah, the formula has been built on since. And like 808 State's new build, which is kinda similar, I don't know if it's aged all that well or I'm old enough to appreciate it to its fullest extent. Still, good stuff here, and definitely worth at least one listen. And also, fun fact, the track Mystery of Love from this album got sampled by Kanye and turned into Fade, so that's cool too. Okay, here we've shifted over to that much smoother and more soulful Chicago house sound. The guy even sings on it and has guest vocalists on everything. Guy's not a bad singer either. I mean, his voice is a good match for these instrumentals. This is some really good stuff. Get my attention here. Oh boy. This is the best kind of dated 90s cheese. It's not gonna be for everyone. If you don't like this old school 90s house pop sound, then this is not gonna change your mind. But I've always really loved this sound, and I really enjoyed this thing as well. Okay, now we've moved into his stuff under his real name, Larry Heard, going back to straight instrumental, down-tempo, deep house stuff. I've been inspired by these kinds of sounds in my own music for years, though I've never had a name to attach them to. So, yeah, now I do, and I can give my thumbs up on this for sure. Unsurprisingly, given the title, we've moved into some pretty spacey territory, and unsurprisingly had a lot of fun with this one too. Okay, more straightforward instrumental deep house. Nothing new from him, but still good. Mostly down-tempo thing here, pretty nice. Another ambient down-tempo thing with a lot more vocals this time around. I think I like the previous one a little more, but this one's cool too. Another kinda smooth, jazzy vocal house thing. Slightly more energetic than Love's Arrival as well. I think I like this one a little more than that one too. Ooh, a double album here, kinda, sorta. The first half, the duality is smoother and jazzier like the previous album, and the second half, the double play, suddenly brings him back into straight acid house. So, yeah, pretty interesting. Which brings us to here. Now, that last album came out in 2005, interestingly right around the time that I discovered GarageBand and started making music myself. It's obviously been a ridiculously long time since we've gotten anything substantial out of this guy. So far, I haven't gotten the indication that we'd get something bad out of this album. At the very worst, this guy has at least delivered, you know, pleasant, danceable, background music-y house music. But I like how each of these albums have had a slightly different feel to them. Like, the idea of this being a new Mr. Fingers album and not a Larry Heard album is also interesting. I mean, does that mean we are going to get some kind of modern update on the kind of stuff he was doing on Amnesia, or just some straight 90s throwback vocal pop like on Introduction or Back to Love? Or just get something completely different entirely? Well, after hearing Cerebral Hemispheres, it basically comes off to me as doubling down on his last Larry Heard album, soundtrack from the Duality double play. There's a pretty clear first half and second half, the first half being his smoother. The first half being his smoother and jazzier chill stuff, and the second half being darker, more electronic, acid house influenced stuff. It kind of covers a lot of the same bases as his previous albums, especially as Larry Heard, and it doesn't bring in much you haven't heard before. But despite that, I thought this was actually much better executed than Duality Double Play. In fact, between the variety, the production, and the structuring of the album as a whole, I might even go so far as to call Cerebral Hemispheres Larry Heard's best album yet. I mean, maybe. It wouldn't be by a massive wide margin, but this is a really good album. If I hadn't heard any of the Larry Heard albums and skipped to here straight from Back to Love, I would have been mind blown by this album, and how it covered so much untouched territory the other three Mr. Fingers albums didn't. I wouldn't say I was mind blown by this after actually hearing all the Larry Heard albums. Kinda comes off to me like Goldie's The Journeyman, except not as emotionally engaging, I guess. Yeah, I will have to admit, no single track on here really floored me, but none of them were unenjoyable either. Every track on here ranges from good to great, and I was never bored at any point either. Had to keep myself just from picking every track on here as my favorite tracks. Just a really strong, solid, well-constructed, and well-produced album that plays pretty heavily into my own personal music tastes. So let's talk about this from a more individual track basis. Fair bit to cover there, given how there's 18 tracks. So like I said, there are two halves to this album, and the first half is smoother, more laid-back, jazzier. There's some vocal tracks and some instrumental tracks. Generally, I prefer the instrumentals. Stuff like the piano-heavy City Streets and the especially jazzy and lush Urbane Sunset, which features plenty of saxophones and vibraphones. Those two are probably my two favorites from the first half of this album. The guitar-heavy Tiger Lounge and the somewhat more energetic Sao Paulo are pretty good too, even if they don't stand out as strongly. As for the vocal tracks, they're all nice additions and add variety. My favorite of those in the first half was probably Sands of Aruba, which had the widest and most satisfying instrumental palette with some really nice, chill saxophone solos. I mean, the lyrics just kinda say the title over and over, which is maybe a little disappointing, and a bit more disappointing in the similarly repetitive A Day in Portugal, which doesn't have as good an instrumental to justify the incredibly simplistic lyrics. But both of those are enjoyable tracks anyways. Like, it kind of reminds me of a Cascade track. He once had a track called Take Your Mind Off, which was just kind of said the same line over and over, and it had this kind of chill jazz vibe, probably inspired by this guy. But, yeah, I really liked that track, and as a result, I can get behind these kind of more repetitive vocal tracks regardless. So yeah, Full Moon and Crying Over You say more than just their titles over and over. I appreciate both of them for that. Full Moon I'm a bit on the fence over how strong an opener it is. Sometimes I thought it was alright, and other listens I could get into it more, but whatever, still a good track. Crying Over You is probably the strongest emotional sentiments put into the lyrics, I'll give a credit for that as well. In general, by the way, Larry Heard singing sounds like almost exactly the same as he did back in the 90s, so that deserves credit as well. Guy doesn't sound like he's aged much at all. Now, there is one more kind instrumental in the first half that sort of acts as a transition between the two halves, that being the more electronic-heavy title track, Cerebral Hemispheres. This, by the way, is why I believe this album was better executed than Duality Double Play, because it tries harder to make the two halves work together. On that one, the transition between the two halves felt really sudden and jarring. We went from a smooth jazz sort of track right into a rough and abrasive acid house track, and it did not flow naturally at all. Here, though, there's much more effort to ease you into the second half with this more chill electronic heavy track, kind of bridging the gap there. Actually, the second half in general is fairly chill and doesn't contrast the first half as heavily as Duality Double Play's second half. But there's still vocal tracks on here, like The Closer, Praise the Vibes, which sort of brings the album around full circle and sounds like it came from the first half of the album, with jazzier instrumentation and vibraphones and all that. And the guest singer, Nicole Ray, sounds great over the track. She tries to make a bit more effort not to just sound like some generic female singer, with a bit more complex flow in some parts, so yeah, she was really good. The other vocal track from the second half, Stratusfly with Paul St. Hilaire, or however you say that, it's kind of on the forgettable side, admittedly. If not for the fact that it's surrounded by a lot more electronic heavy stuff, it wouldn't have left much of an impression on me otherwise. Not a bad track either, though. So what about the rest of the second half? Well, the track Electron is probably the closest a Larry Heard track has ever come to sounding epic. The dramatic and intense synth melodies really keep me engaged on this one. There's also Outer Acid and Inner Acid. Between the two, I probably prefer the former. It's a little more low-key, but the acid hit synths on here paired up with the jazzier instrumentation in the background almost kinda give me a sort of Orbital Green album kind of vibe. Inner Acid is more urgent, more dissonant, more energetic as well, so that's a pretty nice one there too. There's also the track Spy, which is a bit darker take on some of the instrumentals from the first half. Bit more intense and urgent, but, you know, still pretty mysterious and kind of longing as well. There's also the almost samba-like Nod Ya Head, with all of its strange percussion textures, which does in fact get me to nod my head. And finally, there's two really nice spacey instrumentals near the end in the form of Qwazars and Aether. The former being a bit more rhythmic and maybe a little catchier, but the latter being a lot more expansive and breezier, both really satisfying tracks to listen to. And that's basically it as far as individual tracks go. So overall on this thing, it may not precisely be delivering on anything new for the guy, and there are a couple of weaker moments on this thing that don't stick out to me all that much, which I guess is kind of to be expected given how there's 18 tracks. But I do have to say, this is actually a really well-made and consistently enjoyable album. It delivers on lots of different sounds and executes them all well in that nice and chill but still pretty danceable way that Larry Heard has always been able to deliver. Again, there's no track on here that I thought was excellent, but they're all at least good or great. Between the consistency and the fact that I've always really enjoyed these particular styles of chill out and house music, I had fun with this from front to back. This was a really well executed, consistent, varied, and interesting album. Good to see this old legend still totally got it, and I definitely recommend giving it a shot if you want some house music on the more chill side. And as a side note, if you really liked this album, you may also like my 2011 album, Marble Jar, pretty similar kind of sound and vibe to that one. Or my 2017 compilation, The Debut is Too Of Is Two in His Eye, which has some pretty obvious Chicago house influences in it as well. But whatever, and shameless plug. I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.
You woke up this morning, got about